Let's bring in meteorologist and science policy analyst Chris Martz to discuss this. Okay, Chris, ABC News reported that more than 800 wildfires have been burning across Canada. And every time this seems to happen, people always say, well, it's because of climate change. And so climate change is the reason why this is happening. Talk to us about why we're seeing these types of fires now. It almost seems like up there, almost like on an annual basis.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. Of course, every year there are fires, and unfortunately, over the last 4 years, we have seen the secondhand effects of it from the smoke being blown downwind into the lower 48. And this has happened before. A lot of people don't remember it happening so much as it has the last few years. That's just because of weather patterns. But you can go back to May 1780 when New England had their dark day. Skies turned black. The people had to, light up their, candles and everything. So it was very ominous that what happened then. And then, of course, in September 1881, the same kind of thing happened. The skies turned yellow. It was called New England's Dark Day. And that coincided with record-breaking temperatures well up into the hundreds, all the way up into New England during that heat wave. So the heat and the smoke really reduced air quality. It was probably worse than anything we've seen this past weekend. Now, personally, I don't think necessarily that threatening tariffs is going to do much. Now, Trump's a businessman, but this is a different situation. But over 50% of the fires in Canada each year are actually caused by lightning. And what a lot of people probably don't realize is that most of Canada's forests are remote. They're well inland away from cities in the urban corridor, which kind of runs parallel to the U.S. border. So forest management practices could definitely help that. But the problem is that they're very hard to get to because they're so isolated, whereas the United States, it's a lot easier. But we look at the number, people always say, well, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier. If you look at drought in Canada, there's been no increase since 1910, and the number of heat wave days has actually declined slightly over that same period. So there's no indication that the weather conditions conducive for fires are getting worse.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because people always say, well, we're seeing so many more fires, and that's because it's getting hotter. But I don't think, as you point out, the data doesn't really support that there's been some sort of major spike in wildfire activity, either in the U.S. or Canada, that could be attributed to climate change. You mentioned forest maintenance and for a forest maintenance strategy. The president talked about this when he went out to California and had a little tiff with Gavin Newsom about how they manage their forests up in California and help mitigate fires. Talk to our audience about what forest management is and why it's important.
Yeah, sure. Forest management is something that's done. There's two primary ways to do this, and one is by mechanical thinning, where you actually go in and have teams clear out the underbrush and all of that, stop leaves, twigs, those small diameter fuels that accumulate on the forest floor. And those become very highly flammable when weather conditions change. This is especially true out in California, which this happens every year, regardless of whether you're in drought or it's been wet compared to average. And there's other thing that they do is prescribed burning, where you actually burn that stuff and you can control it so it clears all that underbrush out and it prevents the buildup of those small diameter fuels on the forest floor. So in the United States, this could be done a lot better. In California, this is what Trump was talking about when he talked to Governor Newsom about raking the forests. That's what he meant by that. In Canada, though, it's a lot more difficult to have forest management because of the fact that the forests are so isolated or hard to get to. I think there's like 9,000 times more trees than there are people in Canada. I saw that statistic the other day. But it would help if they could access those forests for sure. But the thing is, it's not as feasible as it is in the United States.
Usually when you have a left-wing government, the environmentalists really dictate policy. And do you think that there's a situation in Canada where they're not where these practices, this type of public policy, maybe the type of expenditures and access infrastructure that you're talking about has not actually happened because the environmental community's influence on the left-wing government up there?
I can't speak entirely to Canada's situation, but I do think that that's a possibility. There's so much when it comes to environmental policy. There's so much emphasis, and this is true in Europe. This is true in the United States. So it's probably true in Canada, where you have a lot of these sort of left-wing politicians that will focus on the environment. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to focus on the environment and being good environmental stewards for the planet. The problem is that a lot of times when it comes to like reducing CO2 emissions or these net zero policies, they're not going to be that effective in mitigating these risks. It's the same thing we see with all types of extreme weather. They say if we go to net zero, we won't have hurricanes anymore. That's not true. We need to have better infrastructure. We need to have better city planning. We need to have better forest management. The water bombers, they could have more of those. That would certainly help.
And at the end of the day, you're not going to stop the lightning. So that's that's it. Chris Martz, thank you very much for breaking all that down for us. We appreciate you.